This video is part of a series where I'm taking excerpts from a conversation I had with Timothy Sandifer on the right to earn a living. You can check out the previous videos by going into the description. The links will be there. Let's get to the conversation. So we've talked about some of the good. Now we'll move on to what are some of the worst examples of the right to earn a living being violated, and maybe we'll break it into a couple parts, perhaps historically. I mean, historically within the U.S., and then maybe also some examples of today within the United States.
Well, certainly historically at the top of the list would have to be racial and sexual discrimination in various forms and oppression of minority groups through legal institutions and social institutions that deprived them of the right to earn a living. The first one obviously would be slavery, but also the prohibition of women from entering certain trades and professions, and other racial groups. Particularly, I'm from California originally. In California, although it didn't have slavery, it had the discrimination against the Chinese laborers who arrived in the 19th century to build the railroads and work in the gold fields. And, in California, until the 1950s, a Chinese person was not allowed to own property in the state. So what you have historically with all sorts of different ethnic groups and with women have been legal and economic systems put into place to keep them from competing economically in various ways. So, for example, slavery was obviously about extracting labor from people without payment. But with regard to the Chinese, there were various taxes and licensing laws that were imposed on the Chinese to keep them from earning a living in California. California, for example, would impose a $2 a day mining tax on every Chinese laborer engaged in mining. $2 a day was a tremendous amount of money in the 1860s. So California imposes this, and of course, if you can't pay, then you get thrown in jail. So then California, some of the cities passed laws saying if you get thrown in jail, you have to have your head shaved, which they claimed was a sanitary measure. But the real reason was because the Chinese at the time wore their hair in these long queues, and that had a lot of social and cultural importance to them. So it was just a way of being cruel and nasty to the Chinese. So what you find is that at the bottom of a lot of these forms of discrimination is a desire to prohibit economic competition. One thing that I found particularly interesting about the anti-Chinese movement in California in the 19th century is that other forms of racism, it typically takes the form of somebody saying, oh, this group, Hispanics, blacks, whatever, they're lazy and stupid. But in California in the 19th century, it was the opposite of that. When you read the literature of the time, what the white Californians say over and over again is the Chinese are really smart and they work really hard, and we can't compete against them economically, so we have to throw them out of the state. You got to give them credit for their candor, right? So the number one answer is, and of course, shouldn't leave out the women. Women were prohibited from a lot of trades, both by licensing laws, which the Supreme Court upheld in the 1870s in a case called Bradwell versus Illinois, and some other cases that came after that. Licensing laws, but also minimum wages and other kinds of restrictions on employment. Minimum wage laws originally applied only to women. They said you can't hire a woman except at, $10 an hour or whatever. But of course, that only applied to women. So if you're an employer, what are you going to do? You're going to fire your women. You're going to hire men instead because they're cheaper. And so that was a very common strategy by male-dominated labor unions to keep out competition from female labor, was to raise these minimum wages and say, oh, we're trying to protect the women from low wages, when what they're really doing is lining their own pockets. So the number one obvious example historically is that this economic liberty has been a reality for very few in American history. And of course, the blessing, the good side of that story is that it has expanded historically over time, so that more and more people have been able to participate in that process and earn a living for themselves and gain independence. And that independence, of course, then fosters more diversity.
Yeah, the minimum wage one is interesting. That's explicit, or that sometimes it's couched in, well, first I'll say some people honestly believe, I would say they're wrong, that this is helpful. But there are there are some cases where throughout the world where it's been indicated specifically targeted against Black workers or against indigenous populations
Right.
or against immigrant groups. You have lawmakers on record when the bills were being debated discussing that. So those are pretty egregious.
And we should say up
awful.
front that the minimum wage, as far as the people who think that it's beneficial for workers, the minimum wage as a benefit for workers is science denial. It is as much science denial as young earth creationism or anti-vax attitudes or anything like that. The idea that the minimum wage helps low-wage workers earn more money has been debunked so thoroughly and so repeatedly by economic science, and it is so contrary to the basic principles of economic science that it is not possible for an informed person to honestly believe that minimum wages help the poor. They are fundamentally irrational superstitions, but they're easy to exploit by those who want to keep out competition. And so that's why the wage constantly rises and why it is very often written in such a way as to apply specifically to those groups that present an economic threat to the status quo.
Yeah. So that's, historically those are some, and certainly we have minimum wages today. What are some, I know there's some other examples that I remember you pointed out in the book of specific examples that are almost tough to believe these are in place as ways to restrict the right to earn a living. So often it might be a state-specific law, or sometimes it's broader than that. Any examples of today that think are pretty egregious violations?
To me, the most egregious and unreasonable is the so-called certificate of need, or it's also called a certificate of public convenience and necessity. There's some of the states have different terms for it, but what these are licensing laws that do not assess whether or not you are qualified to practice that trade. Instead, they're licensing laws that allow the existing businesses to forbid you from entering the business at all. So, for example, some states have these in place for moving companies. I did a case some years ago in Kentucky where they had a state law that had a certificate of public convenience and necessity for moving companies. You want to start a moving company, you have to file an application for a certificate with the state's Department of Transportation. And it then notifies all of the existing moving companies and gives them the opportunity to object. And guess what? They usually do, because they don't want competition.
Yep.
And their objection is not based on the idea that you're unqualified or a danger to the public at all. Their objection is that they don't want economic competition. And so when an objection is filed, the state says, no, sorry, you're not allowed to have a certificate because somebody objected, unless you can prove to a government bureaucrat that there is a future need for a new moving company. Now, what is a future need? As you and I just said a few minutes ago, it's not possible to determine the future. There's no way anybody could possibly tell what people are going to need in the future. So it becomes involved. In fact, in that lawsuit, I asked the state's expert that was their witness. I said to him, okay, what are the objective standards you use to determine future needs in the moving industry? And he said, quote, there are no objective standards, end quote. Okay, so, right. It's entirely, however, whether we feel like letting you earn a living or not. Unfortunately, it's not just moving companies. These laws are in place regulating a lot of the medical industry, medical clinics, and psychologists, along with lots of obstetrics clinics, all sorts of different medical and semi-medical businesses are subject to these kinds of laws. There's a case right now, actually, as we speak, that's pending in the U.S. Supreme Court that we're hoping the Supreme Court will take up, from Louisiana, where they have a law like this in place that says you're not allowed to open a psychological clinic without permission from the existing psychology clinics. And so this woman, she just wants to help people who are facing great difficulties in their lives. These people might be, suicidal, depressed, they need help. And she's not allowed to give them help unless the government says, well, we feel like letting you, not based on quality or skill, but based on their some bureaucratic decision of whether it's okay to compete. And the Court of Appeals said that was okay. And the reason they said it was okay was because by limiting the number of clinics, that makes it easier for the state to inspect the clinics and make sure that they're running properly. Well, my goodness, by that logic, you might as well say that there can only be one psychology clinic in the entire state, because then it would be really easy to monitor it, right? This is ludicrous, and yet it's been the law for a very long time. These laws should be completely abolished. In my view, they are totally unconstitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court said in the 50s that all occupational licensing laws must be based on a person's capacity to practice that business. And these laws are expressly not dependent on whether you're qualified. So I think they're across the board unconstitutional, but unfortunately, courts rarely care about these issues, and so they just fester over the years.
This video is from a longer conversation I had with Timothy Sandifer. The next video will be coming out soon. Hope you tune in for that one as well. See you in the next video.